Welcome to No Filter Doctor, where we cut through the health hype, dig into what's real, what works, and what's backed by evidence. I'm your host, Dr. AK. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back. We are going to start talking a little bit about the new dietary guidelines. So I wrote a 3-part blog on the topic, and what I want to get into is first, what are these dietary guidelines? Like, what are the new ones that came out in 2025? How different are they from prior versions of it? And kind of just what are they factually? Then part 2, which is going to be next week, we are going to talk about some of the inner turmoil and contradictions in them, because there are some and we should discuss them. And then part 3 is going to be the following week, where we talk about industry influence, who makes up these committees that make the decisions, how do we get the final word out on what the dietary guidelines are. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the guidelines, I feel very compelled to say this. Nutrition has become very divisive in the United States because it is now associated with politics. So I hope that by now, this is like the 20-something episode of this podcast. I hope by now you see that I am rooted in evidence. And so I'm going to invite you to please join me, but do it in a certain way that properly prepares you to be open to this information that we're going to be talking about. So how are we going to prepare? The first way is remove your political lens. Independent of which party you support and what candidates you support, I'm going to ask you, just take that lens off, because when we look at things through that lens, we're not quite open to information. We're very limited by the ideology that we carry with ourselves. So in order to truly be open, we need to remove that lens altogether so that we can be as unbiased as possible. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is please ignore whatever social media sources you are getting information from while we're going through all of this. And yes, I understand the hypocrisy in that, because a lot of you found me through social media. So I understand what I'm asking you to do is a little bit contradictory here, but there is so much misinformation on social media. And the problem with the way these social media algorithms work is they want you on there, right? Advertisers are paying these companies to have their products or services or whatever they want on social media. Well, based on what you have looked at historically, you have a certain algorithm that is going to get pushed in front of you. And so you need to kind of leave that algorithm behind. Otherwise, you're just in an echo chamber. So I'm asking you, no political lens, pretty please, and just put all of the other information that's coming across social media behind. Again, I really feel like at this far into the game, if you have been listening this entire time, I've established myself as someone who tries to be as apolitical as possible when we're talking about all of these different things, and who really looks at the facts and looks at science. So that was a very long-winded introduction and preparation, but I do feel like it was necessary because we are going to get in the weeds. Now, today is relatively weed-free. Today, we're just going to talk about what are these guidelines that are out there right now. And we're not going to get into why people are up in a roar, but I think you can admit that if you go on social media, there is just so much stuff about all of these guidelines. So let's get into that part. The first thing that we need to answer is, why does the U.S. government issue these dietary guidelines? Well, one thing that I think a lot of people conflate here, these are not individualized nutrition plans. The purpose of these dietary guidelines are to address population level public health recommendations. And so these guidelines will mold out that framework for federal nutrition programs, school meals, and there's broad public messaging. Their purpose is to reduce overall chronic disease at a societal level. It's not to optimize your individual metabolic health. So we need to know that first. And I'll be quite honest with you, unless you are a dietitian, a healthcare provider, or somebody who creates public policy, you're not even the target audience for these dietary recommendations. The reason they were made is so that different healthcare providers, physicians, dietitians, and lawmakers have something to kind of frame out their recommendations and things that should be happening overall. It's not for you, the individual consumer, to go read. Now, obviously, that's going to happen. And obviously, you are welcome to model your diet and the things that you're going to do based on that, but you are not the target audience. So I think it's really important to know these things and frame all of this in the proper context moving forward. Before we get into the individual recommendations and what the actual dietary guidelines are, let's talk about how did we even get here? What's the history of these guidelines? Well, they didn't develop overnight. This has been going on for more than a century now with evolving nutrition guidance. And a lot of it is shaped and evolves based on public health priorities, different scientific understandings, and our knowledge of disease patterns. So as these things change, so do these different recommendations. And a perfect example of this is looking at where we started and where we are now. In the early 20th century, the recommendations focused largely on food groups, nutrient adequacy, and disease prevention as related to deficiencies. So back then, things like rickets and pellagra were very prominent. In 1941, the Food and Nutrition Board established the first recommended daily allowances. So those are those RDAs that you might hear about. That's where recommended daily allowance, the abbreviation, comes from. These have been updated multiple times through 1989, and they include things like guidance on energy, protein, and the 25 essential vitamins and minerals. But in the 1970s, a major shift occurred. So the attention turned from nutrient deficiencies into this growing burden of chronic disease. And in 1977, the Senate Select Committee of Nutrition and Human Needs released the Dietary Goals for the United States. And this was a document that laid the foundation for what would become the modern guidelines for Americans. The first official dietary guidelines were published in 1980 by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. And then in 1990, the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act formalized the process and said that these dietary guidelines have to be reviewed and updated every 5 years in recognition of the fact that we learn new things. And so they should be updated to reflect this new knowledge. And so since then, every edition has reflected the prevailing scientific evidence and public health priorities of that time. And then it sets the stage for how nutrition guidance is communicated to the public. One of the things that has changed is we went from food pyramids to my plate back to the pyramid. So let's talk about that. So the U.S. Dietary Guidelines relies heavily on visual models. Now, even though I said you are not the target audience, visual models have always been created so that the public can have a better understanding of where all of this is coming from and what do those recommendations look like on a day-to-day basis. And so the original food pyramid tried to convey a balance between food type and proportionality, but it also introduced a lot of confusion about quantities, priorities, hierarchies. People got really confused. So over time, they got rid of the food pyramid altogether. And in 2011, My Plate was introduced. And so this My Plate shifted towards like a simpler model. It's literally a plate. It's divided in half. There's one quarter that demonstrates a lean protein, another quarter whole grains, and then the rest of the half are fruits and vegetables. And this felt more practical. Well, the new guidelines switched. They went back to the my pyramid. So let's get into these 2025, 2030 guidelines. What do they actually recommend? These guidelines are a revised framework for the federal nutrition guidelines that emphasize food quality and degree of processing over nutrient based targets alone. So the document centers its recommendations on diets composed primarily of whole, minimally processed foods, including veggies, fruits, protein foods, dairy, healthy fats, and whole grains. And it outright says avoid the highly processed foods and sugar sweetened beverages. Other iterations have gone through and talked about, well, reduce sugar, but they've never come out and said, don't eat processed foods. So this is new for this guideline. They retained the public health focus on chronic disease prevention, and they included the life stage specific guidance from infancy through adulthood and into geriatrics. So that has stayed the same. There is still recommendations for breastfeeding, appropriate micronutrient supplementation in infancy, and age-specific nutritional considerations. The entire document goes through primary areas of emphasis such as food sourcing, how food is prepared, and the composition of those foods. And then again, there's repeated references to reducing added sugars, refined carbohydrates, excess sodium, and highly processed foods. So that's the gist of what it says. And like we said, there's also this new pyramid. But how is that different from the prior 2020, 2025 iteration? The new guidelines, if you read them, they go right into like, these are completely different. These are the new age of food dietary guidelines. I mean, they really emphasize that. They did that in the press conference. They did all of that. But I'm not sure there's really that much difference. So some of this arguing that people are doing, I know there are differences. We're going to get to them. Yes, there are controversies and contradictions, and we're going to get to them too. But overall, they're not that different. Both of the documents emphasize diets that are built around nutrient-dense foods, including vegetables, fruits, whole grains, protein, and dairy. They talk about retaining limits on saturated fat. They both say less than 10% of total daily calories should come from saturated fats. They both recommend limiting sodium to less than 2,300 milligrams per day for most adults. Some adults need way less depending on what their comorbidities are. And they advise reducing the intake of added sugars and sugar-sweetened beverages. So they both do that. Both editions also include these life stages. They talk about infancy to adulthood, breastfeeding, vitamin D supplementation, when to introduce allergenic foods. Where the differences do occur really have to do with this focus on calorie limits and how things are framed. So I put together a chart. And if you are on the video version of this, I'm going to post the chart in the video so you can see it. I have the 2020 dietary guidelines and the 2025 dietary guidelines. I'm just going to verbally go through them here. When we talk about protein guidance, the earlier version gave no specific gram per kilogram target. They just recommended a variety of protein-rich foods. But the newer guidelines actually recommend 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And so the way you figure out your kilogram body weight is you measure yourself in pounds and divide by 2.2. And so this is saying take that, multiply it by 1.2 to 1.6, and that's how many grams of protein you should have per day. This has never happened before in a dietary guideline recommendation. And I will tell you, I think this is a great recommendation because the RDA that we had before of 0.8 grams of protein per kilo per day was not enough. Those recommendations were based on nitrogen balancing studies that were done a while ago, and that's not even applicable to us and our daily lives and what we're doing. The protein sources differ a little bit. So the earlier recommendations said lean meats, poultry, seafood, eggs, legumes, nuts, seeds, and soy. The newer ones say all of that, but there's a lesser emphasis on soy and a bigger emphasis on red meat. In terms of dairy, the prior version said fat-free or low-fat dairy also can use fortified soy alternatives. The current says full-fat dairy without any added sugars. Fat guidance, the prior version talked about vegetable oils and limiting the saturated fats. Current version still talks about limiting saturated fats, and they emphasize whole food fat sources such as butter and beef tallow. We're going to come back to that in part 2. We're going to talk about that. In the prior version, there was an emphasis of whole grains stating that half of the grains that we consume should be whole grains. In the current version, they say prioritize fiber-rich whole grains and reduce refined grains. When we talk about ultra-processed foods, there was a lot of indirect recommendations about avoiding some of those ultra-processed foods. In the current form, they just outright say, don't eat them. With added sugars, the prior version said less than 10% of our total daily calories per day should be from sugars, and if you're under 2, avoid sugar altogether. The current version doesn't make any recommended amount. It just says to limit the sugars. Non-nutritive sweeteners were completely welcomed in the 2020 version, and they are completely discouraged in the 2025 version. Alcohol guidance of the 2020 version was consistent with what we've talked about before. Women should have no more than 1 drink per day. Men should have no more than 2. The current version doesn't give any kind of numerical estimation of what people should or should not consume. It just says limit your alcohol consumption. And then one thing that really stands out, and I think this is a dividing point, I'm just saying this as fact though, is the prior iteration took a lot of people's cultures and economic capabilities into consideration when making the recommendations. The current version has a much, much lower emphasis on those things. It's really much more whole foods, eat these things, and there's really no consideration of whether somebody can afford to buy those foods. So those are really the main differences between them. Granted, they're big differences. Granted, a lot of people want to argue about them, but there is still a lot in common. And I think we need to emphasize the fact that there's probably more things that are in common than there are in terms of differences. And I think it's really important for people to know the actual differences and similarities for themselves. I invite all of you to Google the 2025 dietary recommendations and the 2020 dietary recommendations and then make a comparison. I have links to both of them on my blog from Dr. AK's desk. It's in part 1 of the dietary recommendation series. You can click on them there and look at them. Why is this important and why am I placing so much emphasis on this? Because if we're going to debate the contradictions within the guidelines or who's influencing these guidelines or what are some alternative frameworks for them, we need to know the actual facts of what they are. I feel like a lot of people just take these stances and make arguments without having actually read the document. You can't come from a place of facts if you didn't actually read the facts. So I say all of this in preparation of part 2, which we're going to get into next week, where we are going to talk about the contradictions within them because we need to. They exist and we have to be fair and talk about them. This is not a bashing of the 2025 dietary recommendations. I already said that I'm all about the protein recommendations. There's a lot of things in them that I wholeheartedly agree with. There are some things that probably don't really make sense or might not even be feasible. So that's why I invite you to go through and read them so that next week, when we talk about part 2, we can talk about where this confusion is, these internal tensions that arise between some of the messaging and the interpretations, and then how broader forces kind of shape nutrition policy, right? Let's know the facts, and then we'll get into some of the controversy. And I hope to catch you next week. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's No Filter Doctor. If you enjoyed the content, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also go to www.thewholehumanhealthandwellbeing.com and sign up for the weekly newsletter, where you will get a link to the blog, that week's podcast, and a health tip of the week sent directly to you. It's important to know that while I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it's not intended as medical advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The information discussed should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should it replace individualized medical care. If you have questions or concerns about your health, please contact your own healthcare provider. Any decisions to delay or forego a medical evaluation or treatment based on the information discussed in this podcast are made so at your own risk. My only financial disclosure is my medical practice, The Whole Human Health and Wellbeing. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week.